of proverbial sharpness. Rincewind ducked. The blade hissed coldly through the air beside his head, and entered the rock of the cavern roof without slowing. Death screamed a curse in his cold, crypt voice. The scene vanished. What passed for reality on the Discworld reasserted itself with a rush of sound. Liort gasped at the sudden turn of speed with which the wizard had dodged his killing stroke, and with that desperation only available to the really terrified, Rincewind uncoiled like a snake and launched himself across the space between them. He locked both hands around the Dragon Lord's sword arm and wrenched. It was at that moment that Rincewind's one remaining ring, already overburdened, slid out of the rock with a nasty little metal sound. He plunged down, swung wildly, and ended up dangling over a bone-splintering death, with his hands gripping the Dragon Lord's arm so tightly that the man screamed. Liort looked up at his feet. Small flakes of rock were dropping out of the roof around the ring pitons. "Let go, damn you!" he screamed, "or we'll both die!" Rincewind said nothing. He was concentrating on maintaining his grip and keeping his mind closed to the pressing images of his fate on the rocks below. "Shoot him!" bellowed Liort. Out of the corner of his eye, Rincewind saw several crossbows levelled at him. Liort chose that moment to flail down with his free hand, and a fistful of rings stabbed into the wizard's fingers. He let go. Two-Flower grabbed the bars and pulled himself up.
"Say anything?"
said Hrun from the region of his feet. "Just clouds." Hrun lifted him down again and sat on the edge of one of the wooden beds that were the only furnishings in the cell.
"Bloody hell," he said.
"Don't despair," said Two-Flower.
"I'm not despairing."
"I expect it's all some sort of misunderstanding. I expect they'll release us soon. They seem very civilized." Hrun stared at him from under bushy eyebrows. He started to say something, then appeared to think better of it. He sighed instead. "And when we get back, we can say we've seen dragons," Two-Flower continued. "What about that, eh?"
"Dragons don't exist,"
said Hrun flatly.
"Codis of Chimeria killed the last one 200 years ago. I don't know what we're seeing, but they aren't dragons."
"But they carried us up in the air. In that hall there must have been hundreds."
"I expect it was just magic," said Hrun dismissively.
"Well, they look like dragons," said Two-Flower, an air of defiance about him. "I always wanted to see dragons ever since I was a little lad. Dragons flying around in the sky, breathing flames."
"They just used to crawl around in swamps and stuff, and all they breathed was stink," said Hrun, lying down in the bunk. "They weren't very big either. They used to collect firewood."
"I heard they used to collect treasure," said Two-Flower.
"And firewood. Hey," Hrun added, brightening up, "did you notice all those rooms they brought us through? Pretty impressive, I thought. Lot of good stuff about. Plus some of those tapestries have got to be worth a fortune."
He scratched his chin thoughtfully, making a noise like a porcupine shouldering its way through gorse. "What happens next?" asked Two-Flower. Hrun screwed a finger in his ear and inspected it absently.
"Oh," he said, "I expect in a minute the door will be flung back and I'll be dragged off to some sort of temple arena where I'll fight maybe a couple of giant spiders and an 8-foot slave from the jungles of Klatch. And then I'll rescue some kind of a princess from the altar, and then kill off a few guards or whatever, and then this girl will show me the secret passage out of the place, and we'll liberate a couple of horses and escape with the treasure."
Hrun leaned his head back on his hands and looked at the ceiling, whistling tunelessly. "All that?" said Two-Flower.
"Usually."
Two-Flower sat down on his bunk and tried to think. This proved difficult because his mind was awash with dragons. Dragons. Ever since he was 2 years old, he'd been captivated by the pictures of the fiery beasts in the Octarine fairy book. His sister had told him they didn't really exist, and he recalled the bitter disappointment. If the world didn't contain those beautiful creatures, he'd decided, it wasn't half the world it ought to be. And then later he had been bound apprentice to Ninereeds the Master Account, who in his grey-mindedness was everything that dragons were not, and there was no time for dreaming. But there was something wrong with these dragons. They were too small and sleek compared to the ones in his mind's eye. Dragons ought to be big and green, and clawed and exotic and fire-breathing. Big and green, with long, sharp... Something moved at the edge of his vision, in the furthest, darkest corner of the dungeon. When he turned his head, it vanished, although he thought he